Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar on considering ENS impacts related to green hydrogen. My name is Keisha Blaser, and I will be facilitating the behind-the-scenes portion of today's webinar, though you will mainly be hearing from our presenters who you'll meet in just a moment. Today's webinar, if you hear anything that you would like to share on your social media networks, please feel free to do so, and please tag IAIA using our handle there at IAI Network, as well as the hashtag IAIA webinar. So today's webinar is being hosted by IAIA, or the International Association for Impact Assessment. And before we get started, I'd like to point you to www.iaia.org, which is our website, where you can find a variety of different resources related to impact assessment and today's topic. So first off, there are a few webinars on demand that are available for you. So there's just a couple listed on the screen, but we have a bunch more on a variety of topics. So a couple there are psychosocial impact assessment, which we just had last week, which covers the basics of PSIA and how it strengthens social and health impact assessment. Additionally, there's also a webinar on digital IA and AI, keeping the human in the loop, which shows a specific AI technology tool called MyEzra, which is an assistant essentially for ENS tools. Additionally, in addition to webinars, there's a variety of upcoming events that you can look at as well. So first, I'd like to highlight our annual conference, IAIA 25, which this year is happening in Bologna, Italy on the 1st through 4th of May. Registration is now open and is open until the 10th of April, so I encourage you to go to that website and look at more of the conference. In addition to the main conference, where we have over 100 different sessions on a variety of topics, we also have pre-conference training courses that you can register for, as well as technical visits before and after the conference as well. Next up, our next free webinar is being offered in mid-January on sustainability and the circular economy in Latin America. Registration is currently open for that webinar as well, and like I said, it's free, so I encourage you to go read more about that and get registered if you're interested. Additionally, we have a variety of online training and mentorship available through our professional development program. So right now, registration is actually open for both of our courses. First, we have a Foundations of Impact Assessment course, which is going to be running from January to April, which covers the foundations of environmental impact assessment. And we also have our newer course, Social Impact Assessment, which, just as the title says, is focused on social impact assessment. And that course is running from February to the end of April. And finally, in addition to all those training courses and webinars, we also have a variety of free downloadable publications. So if you're looking for something more involved, we have a variety of best practice principles, but we also have really short and sweet resources like our IA Fast Tips and more. So again, if you're interested in any of those resources, please go check them out at www.iaia.org. Now, a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. First off, yes, today's webinar is being recorded. So if you're registered for the webinar, a recording will be sent to you within a day or two of the live broadcast, as well as the slides that were used today. And if you're not registered, you are not seeing this right now live, but it will also be available on our website on demand for the future. Next up, at the end of the webinar, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A with the presenters today, but don't feel like you have to wait till the end to ask your questions. At any point, if the speakers say something that sparks a question for you, please go to the Questions tab on the control panel for GoToWebinar and type your question in there, and the presenters will read through them and flag them for the Q&A. Now, we might not get time to answer all of your questions, but do please type them in so we can see those for the Q&A. And lastly, the slides will be available. Like I said, they'll be emailed to you with the recording within a day or two of the live broadcast. So with that, Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Keisha. As Keisha mentioned, my name is Deborah Zanowicz, and I am happily moderating this event. And the idea for this topic came about as Washington area branch members of IAIA, or we like to call ourselves WAB. We're in discussions about topics that they would like to learn more about. And we thought that this particular topic would have a much broader range of interest. And we are partnering with IAIA HQ to provide this as a webinar so that a lot more people have access to the discussion. We have 3 panelists or speakers who are going to share their experiences with green hydrogen. And we're focusing mostly on the production side of green hydrogen. And as people may have been hearing, green hydrogen may be a good way to try and transition to a low carbon economy in the future, but there's also some challenges with going forward to this. And for those who aren't sure, green hydrogen, because we have gray hydrogen, and that's hydrogen which is produced from natural gas. We have blue hydrogen, again, which is extracted from natural gas, and there's also a carbon capture and storage component to that particular way of producing hydrogen. And then green hydrogen is focused in on produced using renewable energy. And I wanted to give a brief introduction to our speakers. Mr. Chris Prangle began his career at a reputed engineering office active in solid waste treatment, and he's since 2019 been piloting and developing large-scale, gigawatt-scale green hydrogen projects for different international consortia. He has a deep knowledge of various green hydrogen and conversion technologies, which form the basis for state-of-the-art feasibility studies and concrete projects. And he will be providing a bit of an overview from a developer's perspective to green hydrogen. That presentation will be followed by Ariel Kushner's presentation, focusing in on some of the environmental and social impacts of that. For those who are members of the Washington area branch, you know that Ariel is the co-chair, the other co-chair of our branch, along with me, and that we've been together for a while providing WAB events. So Dr. Kushner has over 30 years of experience in assessing risks and impacts and developing mitigation actions for projects across multiple infrastructure sectors in various parts of the world. His focus will be on experience in South America, and we're looking forward to learning more about his experiences with that. Jay Wagner from Plexus Energy is going to be also providing his perspective and experiences on environmental and socioeconomic challenges and opportunities related to green hydrogen. And he also will be sharing his experiences from case studies that he'll share more on. And now turning over to Chris to begin. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon. Trying to share my screen. Just a second. Can somebody confirm you can see my screen?
Looks great.
Yeah. All right. So, pleasure to present here. I'll walk through some of the commercial and technical challenges around green hydrogen projects, and then I do that from a developer's perspective, being a developer ourselves. So on Net Zero Works, what we consider as the key success factors for green hydrogen projects. I'll zoom in a bit on the potential of the Atlantic Coastal Sahara, providing some highlights on projects in Mauritania and Morocco we are working on, and then I'll end with some challenges and opportunities in developing and maturing those projects. So we support developers of utility scale production and export facilities. So that means that we are not focused on over the fence delivery of hydrogen projects, typically here in Europe. So we target large scale green hydrogen projects which are meant for export. So we have extensive project development experience in various fields. And so we have also developed our own internal modeling and optimization software, which is called BrainWorks, which is basically a digital twin of the entire value chain, including renewables, electrolysis, compression, hydrogen storage, ammonia synthesis, methanol synthesis, etc. And we are mandated by Sahamco, which is an Emirati company who is developing projects in Morocco and Mauritania. So to set the scene, the green hydrogen sector did not really live up to its promises. So a lot of those projects are being delayed or are being cancelled even. So I think the result or the reason, one of the reasons for that was that the sector itself have been a bit over-promising on itself. Green hydrogen is not the silver bullet or the Swiss Army knife, but it is essential for decarbonization in specifically hard-to-abate industries. I think also the green hydrogen sector faces economic constraints. Of course, we are in a situation where there's a lot of geopolitical unrest. There where we can electrify, we should electrify first. So renewables, as in Europe, should first be used for electrification and only then look at hydrogen. A lot of projects have actually been or are being developed in locations which now seem to be a bit suboptimal. I'll come back to that later. And of course, we have seen some delays in the regulatory framework and incentivizing programs. As in any other new industry, there's always a bit of lobbying going on. But we think that in 2025, 2026, maybe some more projects will be pushed back or even cancelled. But at the end of the day, I think there's still a bright future for green hydrogen. I'm based in Europe, so I'll talk about Europe. We largely rely on imports for molecules, grey and green molecules in the future. Today, we see a lot of interest in carbon capture and sequestration. Also there, we believe that will kind of calm down a bit because developing those projects is not easy either, where you need to have a combination of gas and sequestration possibilities quite close to one another. Especially Europe is also now working on the accounting rules for upstream methane emission. So basically all of that comes in a requirement where you have 90 or even 95% CCUS requirements, which would also then kind of increase the cost a bit. The Renewable Energy Directive, the third revision, is voted and will need to be implemented in the European member states in 2025. And the International Maritime Organization is working on the decarbonization rules and the emission accountants. So all in all, looking at 2030, where, for example, RED III will come into force and 42% of the hydrogen being used in Europe will need to be green, and basically 2030 is tomorrow, knowing that there's a couple of years of development and at least 3 years of construction for such kind of big projects. So what we look for when we look at utility scale projects, so we need to have a perfect complementarity between solar and wind. We need to have sea and seaport access. We want to be as close as possible to the demand centers here in Europe. Looking at the maritime sector, we want to be close to the bunkering facilities. We require huge plots of land, so we would like to have minimal societal impact, create a positive social impact as much as we can, and we need to have projects which are ready to scale so that we can benefit from better technologies or more efficient technologies at cheaper cost in the future. I just want to focus a bit on the complementarity between solar and wind because that's really important. I think when we do an export project, we would typically be looking at ammonia, being that one of the easiest vectors to transport the hydrogen. And so there, the capacity factor, which you typically see in traditional solar and wind projects, it's a bit shortcoming. And that's because the flexibility of the ammonia synthesis loop is fairly limited. If you then look at projects which have been announced, and this is an overview of projects that would target a production of about 1 million tons of ammonia per year, you see that there's big difference in the amount of renewables that would need to be installed in order to provide that output. And that's because the capacity factors and also the complementarity between solar and wind. And if you then, from a cost perspective, there's some references that we recently got here in Europe, where the best of, or the average in Spain under the European Hydrogen Bank tender was about close to €6 per ton. Germany and Belgium was even €11, and that's intermittent power supply, intermittent hydrogen supply, because the renewables are intermittent. So if you would need to add storage, like salt cavern, you could easily add another 1.52 euros. The Fertiglobe tender, which is basically the H2 Global tender, was 811 euros per metric ton FOB in the Suez Canal. So that would, including shipping, conversion, meaning the cracking back into hydrogen, would end up being about €8. Here we made an overview of the FOB ammonia cost being 600, 800,000 euros, and then also the distance, or the distance from the production hub to the demand center, over 4,000 and 600,000 nautical miles. And there you see that in the orange part, when you sail on your own ammonia, of course, the more expensive the ammonia is, and the further you need to sail, the more expensive the landed ammonia cost will be. And that same ammonia will then be used for the cracking back into hydrogen. So you have an exponential effect where you see that when you have a region which is benefiting from low complementarity between solar and wind, you would typically be at the range of 1,000 or even sometimes a bit higher. If you then look at 6,000 nautical miles, it really becomes very expensive or even not affordable. For comparison, here we made a small link to blue hydrogen or blue ammonia, in this case from the West Coast. That gives you a bit of the range or the feeling with the cost, which is one of the main reasons why projects are not moving forward, and that's simply because of affordability. Zooming on the Atlantic coastal Sahara, this is a map where the complementarity between wind and solar is mapped, or is kind of put on top of each other, where you see here that this is what we call the Morocco and Mauritania. There you have a lot of wind and solar, of course. Around the equator, it's not really suitable, apart from some hydro projects which could potentially be used, and then the southern tip of South Africa, Namibia here, but there the wind is mostly offshore, so that would also increase the cost. So if you look at this map, this is IAIA. You see that it's basically the same principle here. It's a mapping of solar and wind, and so the more yellow it is, the better. So here you have the Atlantic coastal Sahara, which is about 2,200 nautical miles from Antwerp or Rotterdam, and you see that Canada is a bit further, Brazil, Namibia. I think this is the West Coast. This is countries like Oman and Saudi, where on top of that you have to pass through the Suez Canal, which would also add up to complexities and cost. So zooming in a bit further, so this is what we call Atlantic coastal Sahara, which basically runs from Guelmim in the southern part of Morocco to Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania, where on average we have about 1 to 5 persons per square kilometer. Nassim, Project Nassim in Mauritania, just a bit of the highlights. So the company, Sahamco, which is the holding company, has secured 1.5 million hectares of exploration zone, and the final site selection is now ongoing. It's a fully integrated project, meaning that it starts from seawater extraction, desalination, demineralization, wind, solar, electrolysis, hydrogen storage, ammonia synthesis, ammonia storage and export. First phase, we are looking at 1 million tons a year of 100% renewable ammonia because we are off the grid, so it's a standalone project. We have the potential to scale up to about 3 to 4 million tons. There's weather data being collected through an extensive wind and solar measurement campaign for more than a year. We have done preliminary IAIA geotechnical, logistical, and port studies and red flag analysis. The pre-FEED is now being initiated, and we target commercial operation in 2031. Mauritania benefits from a very transparent and predictable hydrogen law, which is really essential for developers, where you know when you start, where you will end up in terms of incentives that you get, taxation, royalties, how to deal with the land, how the land will be mobilized, etc. So that's really a perfect platform for developers to work on. Another project in Morocco, a bit smaller but still massive, 500,000 hectares allocated. Again, fully integrated project, kind of the same size. There the potential is even a bit higher. The pre-FEED has been completed for the first phase. We target FID towards the end of 2027 with COD targeted for 31. We have prepared the local integration schedule that deals with the potential of local manufacturing. And here there's a zone that has been made available by the project developer, where about 10,000 hectares would be reserved or is reserved for agricultural use, and where the project will supply excess water to irrigate that area. So the challenges and opportunities. We are, as a developer, sometimes caught in between different issues. When it comes to employment, we have a high potential to employ a lot of people, hundreds and thousands of people during construction, and we can create long-term employment during operation. But at the same time, in those regions, we have a lack of skilled labor. And so governments, they ask us how many people can you employ. So, okay, as an example, for the first phase, we would be looking at 3,000 full-time equivalents during construction and about 500 to 600 during operations, which is very much welcomed. But then at the same time, we see that skilled labor is not available. And so mobilizing those people, training those people, making sure that they move to the right locations, etc. Like in the example of Morocco, young people prefer to stay in the capital or in Rabat or Casablanca or one of the major cities. And so moving to those remote places where those projects are being developed is for them not always equally attractive. Local manufacturing, of course, both the government and we as a developer, we want to maximize local manufacturing. Think about turbine towers, think about turbine blades, think about electrolyzers, etc., etc. But of course, all that may come at an increased cost, and in the end reduces bankability of the project because those people or those companies may not have the track record that the lenders would require in order to finance the project. Remember that the entire industry is still very much under pressure when it comes to the affordability. So any increase in cost may not be to the benefit of the project. It's something to deal with. Infrastructure. Those projects that can serve as an enabler to build or to improve basic infrastructure. Think about ports, roads, etc. But of course, that ends up being sometimes a chicken and egg situation where A port developer will not start developing the port if he does not have the visibility on the projects, and the projects, they kind of are hindered by their development if they don't have visibility on the development of the basic infrastructure. So this is sometimes an issue where we believe those projects or those basic infrastructure need to be developed together with the developers of the green hydrogen projects in close cooperation with the local authorities. Hosting countries are, of course, also looking at direct financial benefits. As I said, the sector faces issues of affordability. At the same time, of course, the governments they want to monetize on the resources that they have, and for that they would be looking at direct financial benefits, and that puts stress onto those projects as well. Legal framework, I mean, we need to have predictability, visibility, but we see that in a lot of countries, governments are still trying to find out how they have to deal with those new projects, that new economy, and so they kind of, some of the governments, they kind of take it step by step, where they ask developers to start developing, and where then only at a later stage they would go and sit together with them to see how they would either incentivize them or how they would deal with the direct financial benefits which they would like to draw from the projects. When it comes to CSR, as I said, we have a nice potential to supply excess energy, which typically then would be intermittent, but that can be solved by battery storage. There's a potential to oversize the water treatment plant, provide drinking water, irrigation, water, etc. But then at the same time, that also creates a need for somebody to do something with that, and that not everything can be left over to the project developer. Then when it comes to environmental and social impact assessment, so typically each developer would run its own IAIA, and then you have the cumulative effects where you have clusters of these projects, multiple projects being developed in the same region, where people have to come together to look at the cumulative effects. Since timelines are not always synchronized and every developer is taking its own time schedules forward, this may create issues as well. See, they have 1 minute left. As I said, and Mauritania is a good example, between the northern border, Nouakchott, and the port of, the northern border and the port of Nouadhibou, and the port of Nouakchott, there's a huge potential. The nice thing about that region is that the wind always comes straight from north-northeast because of the trade winds. That also means that you have a lot of wake losses, or you could potentially have a lot of wake losses from one project onto another. And so limiting this wake losses is very crucial because it has a direct impact on the cost again. And so when we do measurement campaigns, that means that we can measure the wind as it is today, but it's very difficult to simulate or calculate the wind blockage effects, which could potentially come later. And here there's some examples. This is Horns Rev 3, which is the offshore wind farms in Denmark. This is a project in the States, where up to 200 kilometers south of the predominant wind direction, we can have almost 10% in reduced energy production because of wind blockage effects from more northerly projects. And this is really an issue which calls for an integrated development approach where people have to come together, where we have to work on master plans, because if not, you would develop a project thinking that you have 9.5 meters per second, and when you start building, or after a couple of years, it may be a lot less because you have more of or other projects up north of you. So with this, I hand it over to Ariel to take this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know if everybody can hear me right now. Let me share my presentation. Keisha, can you share my presentation, or should I do that?
Yes, if you just go to share screen.
Okay. Is that okay now?
We are seeing the presenter view if you want to just swap the settings. Under display settings, you can swap the view.
Sorry, apologies. Show screens. Okay. Just tell me when you can see it, please.
It's still showing presenter view. On that same screen, if you just click on display settings on the top bar, you should be able to swap the presenter view.
It says stop showing screen. Change present.
On your PowerPoint slide.
Oh, my PowerPoint. Okay,
Yep.
so.
Under display settings on the top there.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect. There, now we see the right one.
Thank you very much. Apologies for the delay. As I said earlier, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Very interesting. To all of you that are now listening to my presentation, you will see that some of the information that we provided, in fact, complements some of the concepts presented by Chris earlier. One of the objectives of this of my presentation is to offer the viewers some of my experiences in Patagonia region of Argentina, which I've been working for over 10 years in terms of wind farm development, and more recently experiences from 3 green hydrogen feasibility projects I have been involved with, also in the same region. Like some of the ideas that will be presented by me here are results of experiences from traditional wind farm projects and lessons learned from those projects, how we can translate those experiences into the more larger scale green hydrogen projects and the challenges, environmental and social challenges that these projects present. As many of you know, the challenges are not only related to the typical impacts on at the localized level with the footprint of a wind farm project for green hydrogen production, but also to the other components related to the other components in terms of hydrogen production, and that will include also transport, storage, and export of the hydrogen produced. Typically in very traditional wind farm projects, there are the most difficult issues at the beginning of the process, particularly in Patagonia region, has always been the lack of sufficient baseline information to develop a project, environmental social baseline information. Many of the items also to be the challenges to be addressed during the project development in Patagonia include the proximity to associated infrastructure. Most of the existing projects in Patagonia, and similar to the project that Chris mentioned in Africa, Patagonia has 1 or 2 people per square kilometer in density, very low density population densities, and consequently many of the projects that have been developed were developed along existing roads or near existing transmission lines. The other challenges that project development face in the development of these traditional wind farm projects is the availability of workforce nearby. Contrary to the projects that Chris mentioned in Africa, in Patagonia, in Argentina, Argentina possesses a very skilled labor force, but the developers still need to find solutions in terms of how to reach out to this skilled labor force in remote areas like in Patagonia. And of course, there are biodiversity constraints. There's issues associated with stakeholder acceptance. International project financing and financing and exclusion lists are an important issue in traditional wind farm projects. And of course, the legal regulatory framework and approvals. For the successful of the implementation of these projects, typically we included mitigation measures at the design level and proper screening of alternatives in terms of alternative sites for the projects. One important item is the timely baselines and efforts. Like I mentioned earlier, the available information, environmental and social baseline existing for the region, often is related to projects that have developed their own baselines and databases, and consequently not always available to the public. Consequently, any new developer is always in need for developing their own efforts in terms of baseline to decide on locations, alternative selection, and even micrositing. In the case of green hydrogen, as I mentioned earlier, we have multiple other components that require the analysis in terms of implementation. And one of them include, for example, water supply, electrolyzers, as mentioned earlier by Chris, ports and export facilities, waste treatment, storage, conversion into ammonia, and so on. All these components add to the challenges faced by developers in terms of environmental and social impacts that they have to address during project development. The successful implementation of these projects require environmental and social assessments at a larger scale, and consequently, because of these components, the integration of cumulative impacts in identification and management. The scale of the project or the area of influence of the project will depend not only on the nature of the project, will depend only also on the nature of the project. Green hydrogen projects for local energy consumption versus regional global consumption. That is what is the final objective of the project under development. Many of the projects I have been involved with required developing concept for hydrogen export, and consequently the need for exit ports and logistics for the export of this energy source. Among the environmental social challenges that we can observe, compared to traditional wind farm projects, green hydrogen projects require an analysis of both land and marine environments, the need for larger surface areas, and often multiple agreements with landowners, which, by the way, can only be finalized once the siting is decided through the preliminary studies. The potential for importing labor force into more remote Patagonian areas, disposal of production of wastes, As I mentioned earlier, availability of environmental and social baseline that might be insufficient at the time of project evaluation. And not least important, the cost of project development requires international financing, and consequently the applicability of international environmental and social standards to each of the project components. What I'm going to show here is an example, real case example of cost benefits in new wind farm project development, and how important it is to address environmental and social issues earlier in the process. This is what you see in the top of the screen is the conceptual phases of the projects with the different elements in each of the phases. I'm going to show just the impact at this stage of cost impacts in terms of site selection. Typically, particularly for green hydrogen projects, because of the large scale of the projects and this need for a large surface area, there are certain limitations in terms of how many landowners or how many pieces of land the developer can secure early in the project in order to preliminary assess the feasibility of the project. In this case, we are selecting one site, and typically, which is named there Site 2. Typically, economists developing models for the projects in terms of their net present value of the projects, all the way from the initial early development phases to COD operation. Forecast the model's benefits based on ideal conditions. But as we all know, ideal conditions not or never exist, and there are important variations along the way in terms of environmental, social, and even health and safety issues, costs that have never been assessed or considered earlier in the process, and these impact the bottom line, the net present value of the project. Just to give an example, if a project has a $100,000 threshold, acceptable threshold for cost exceeding budget, many of these variations in the environmental and social aspects, unexpected events, can even surpass significantly that $100,000 threshold. And what we see here is that typically in the blue line, as you can see, the actual investment balance, including proper environmental and social management systems and net present value, is lower than the forecasted one, but significantly higher than a project that has not taken environmental and social aspects under consideration early in the project. This delta, this variation, in the case of traditional project, could be from 100,000 to even up to $2 million for a project of 7 to 90 turbine wind farms. So the cost of not considering environmental and social aspects for a green hydrogen project, which has significantly larger scale, could be very important to the bottom line of the investment. Consequently, increasing the net present value and biodiversity protection, for example, in this case, by reducing environmental and social risks and addressing matters in a regional context, will aid the project in achieving its preliminary goals of proper siting. The example I'm going to provide in this presentation is examples that we use in our projects, using bird species of concerns for sensitivity analysis for project siting. The project definition and siting require an understanding of existing environmental and social conditions in a region where knowledge is limited. Consequently, rather than implementing extensive environmental impact studies at this early phase of project development is not advisable, and we provide sensitivity analysis tools that can offer a first important screening to focus the project development on less environmental and social sensitive areas. Migratory bird species or local species of concerns can offer a first screening criteria for project siting. The sensitivity criteria that typically we use was developed by Atienza et al. in 2011. Is a methodology accepted by many international financial institutions, and consequently very useful in terms of not only helping the project developer in identifying the most suitable site for project, but also as a first step in terms of conversations with future lenders. And this include multiple criteria, but as an example, the minimum distance of the project to conservation areas, migration routes within the study area, endemism of species present in the study area, and bird nesting sites or breeding areas that can be impacted by project development. As a consequence of the applicability of these criteria, the project can have in hand criteria that can be remaining criteria that can be mitigated or and consequently move to the next phase in project development. The results of this, the applicability of this criteria include, I'm presenting in this slide, is for example, species of concern like the Cloephaga rubidiecips, the famous Cauquén Colorado. It's a species of geese that is estimated that approximately 900 remaining in the wild. These species, as you can see in the map in the middle, migrates from the southern part of the province of Buenos Aires during the early spring and summer to southern Patagonia, to the breeding grounds, and then returns to Buenos Aires province approximately late summer, late fall, early winter for the wintering area. The interesting thing about this migration path is that really overlaps with many of the existing wind farm projects that have been developed along the coast of Argentina. And consequently, there was always a need for assessing mitigation measures for reducing the impact of collisions with these birds. In the breeding grounds, excuse me, in the breeding grounds in southern Argentina and the border with Chile, one of the aspects that we added to our sensitivity analysis was the assessment of the hydrological conditions in the study area, which is very important for these species of birds in terms of finding nesting sites and feeding grounds during the reproductive time. We overlap these maps with both online information available, like eBird information for the region, and also from our own field service, as you can see in the heat map in the bottom of this slide, where we can identify areas of higher concentration of species, of individuals for these species. Important to understand that the environmental and social conditions are not permanent, and consequently, monitoring and adaptive management is necessary to reduce these impacts. Both environmental and social conditions change over time, and consequently, the impacts that need to be managed and how they are managed will require monitoring and updating our information and management of the mitigation measures. At the end of the day, what we see as very important is the integration of both commercial, technical, and environmental and social aspects in order to properly identify select sites for the project for green hydrogen project development, This includes environmental and social sensitivity analysis and other specialized studies as well, and initial compliance with international standards for project financing. Hydrogen development and production components, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, are multiple components, and consequently it is advisable that the technical designs that consider environmental and social recommendations will be early in the process. It's important that engineers and environmental and social experts collaborate from early in the process. And finally, commercial considerations, including costs of environmental and social mitigation measures and environmental requirements by international financial institutions. Commercial considerations are, of course, key to the success of the project, and the cost of this mitigation of unexpected events can negatively impact project development. Only after this phase one, we can then move, once the site is selected and the agreements are in place, we can move to a phase two, in which environmental and social impact assessments aligned with international standards are implemented. Thank you, and I now pass the baton to Jay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just 1 second. Right. Okay, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Jay Wagner. I'm based in London with Plexus Energy. I'm going to talk about the social and environmental aspects, building on what Chris and Ariel have just been speaking about. Just wanted to start the conversation by saying renewable energy and green hydrogen, of course, are part of the journey of achieving net zero and the climate targets, but there are significant challenges, as Chris already has pointed out, as well as Ariel. A step change is really needed to move from where we are presently, the megawatt stage, to gigawatts. There are a variety of criteria for what constitutes a successful green hydrogen project, and Chris already outlined some of that. What I call the siting dilemma. You need sufficient resources, wind and solar. You need a lot of space, also water for desalination. The infrastructure and logistical requirements in order to be able to scale the project up, but also to meet the cost and economic criteria. But last but not least, there are also environmental and social aspects to be considered. But all of this conspires to drive projects to a certain larger scale. What you see here is just a mock-up of a 10 megawatt green ammonia plant in Australia with a 18 megawatt solar plant associated with it, just to give you a sense of the spatial requirements, which comes to about 60 hectares in this case. Now, moving to a gigawatt scale green hydrogen project, one of them, that, to my knowledge, the only one that is now currently in construction, is the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, and the solar PV component comprises 2.2 gigawatts power, not yet constructed, will have a spatial footprint of about 50 square kilometers, just to give you a sense of scale. This is a mock-up of an overlap of the newer solar complex, concentrated solar project in Morocco, financed by the World Bank. I think it is one of the largest concentrated solar projects in the world, and it just gives you a sense of the scale. And on your right of the screen, you will see a slice of Manhattan, just to show you how large these projects actually are. So what I'd like to do next is just talk a little bit about a project, a feasibility study, an environmental and social scoping assessment that we carried out together with Chris actually in 2023 for a gigawatt scale green hydrogen project. In its first phase, had the project gone forward, and spoiler alert, this project did not receive sanctions, mainly for economic reasons, but it's still an interesting case study. In its first phase, it would have produced 2.3 gigawatts thereabouts and would have scaled up to 7 gigawatts over time. As I said, we carried out a pre-feasibility ENS scoping study. What was interesting and important about that was the integration of the technical and economic specialists and the environmental and social specialists to carry out this risk assessment at this very early stage of project planning. That led to a constraints assessment to try and optimize, understand what the footprint would be, and then optimize and reduce the footprint accordingly. We addressed, or identified rather, 11 material issues that needed to be addressed. And the project was ready at this early stage to go to the next stage of public consultation. I don't have time to go into all of the aspects involved and all the findings, but there are a few that I'd like to highlight. As Ariel was already saying, wind farms and birds are not necessarily the best bedfellows. That was an issue, potential impacts on avifauna. As it happened in this particular instance, although there were significant populations of marine birds in the vicinity of the project, there were no flight paths or feeding routes that were close to the wind farm. So that issue was actually, against what our expectations, was less of an issue. However, it was an arid area and a desalination option or requirement was there, so for the green hydrogen production. And that brings you then into the sensitivity of the marine environment into which you'll be discharging. What do you do with the brine and the toxic chemicals, particularly in a remote area where there is no waste management infrastructure? So it adds to the cost, adds to the complexity. And even in an area like this with excellent wind conditions, intermittency was an issue, necessitating a storage option, which adds to the cost and adds to the footprint of the project. Producing hydrogen and ammonia, these are mature technologies, they're well understood and known, but they are hazardous processes, so you need adequate safety buffers and setbacks. So it becomes a siting issue, even in more sparsely populated areas. There's been a trend in recent years for ever larger wind turbines. For this particular project, the wind turbines would have been about 200 meters in height. You have all the access roads and related infrastructure requirements, even to get the material and the equipment to the site, the foundations that need to be constructed, the concrete and the steel that goes into them, important considerations. You sometimes have to build your own port, even just to start the construction phase. So all of this adds to the footprint and the complexity of the project. This next slide here is just to give you a sense of the size of the hydrogen and ammonia plant, which measured somewhere between 15 and 20 square kilometers. So very considerable infrastructure requirements. Adding to that, the transmission lines, about 6,000 workers at peak construction, twice the size of the local population, 700 people during steady state operations. So very considerable issues to be looked at. Absolutely essential that you carry out early meaningful engagement, and that includes with local authorities. Governments, large and small, don't necessarily always understand the scale of these projects and what's involved. So it's very important to initiate those engagements early on. As I said, in this particular project, it was about to go public at the pre-feasibility stage to discuss these requirements and issues. And here, this next slide is just to give you again a sense of the scale of the the wind farm, the size of the turbines, that brings up landscape and visual impact, even in sparsely populated areas, particularly where you might have tourist interests intersecting. These are important aspects that need to be considered, as I said, even in remote areas. Another very important issue that we came across was the presence of the peat in this particular location. Peatlands, as you may know, cover about 3% of the world's surface land area, but they are one of the largest terrestrial carbon stocks, storing about twice the amount of carbon compared to all of the world's forests combined. So this was an important consideration. It wasn't necessarily a red flag, but there are studies which show that wind farms on top of peatland may not be carbon neutral. So it's something that needs to be carefully studied. You need to minimize and optimize the footprint in such cases to avoid that you're actually emitting more carbon than you ostensibly are saving. Avoid areas of deep peat and follow best practices. In this instance, it necessitated further research, which would have been carried out had the IAIA gone forward. So the conclusions of this particular study was green does not necessarily equate to public acceptance. It's hard work from the earlier stages, asking really how green is the green hydrogen, and that is very location and context specific. What was very important again was the early stage scoping and issue identification exercise and the collaboration of technical economic experts and environmental and social experts. Absolutely essential to initiate transparent and meaningful engagement with key informants and other stakeholders early on in the process, and to arrive at a constraints assessment to optimize the footprint. As I said, in this case, there were some potential major impacts or red flags, but all of this warranted further study. But in this particular instance, the project did not proceed for economic reasons. Just turning to another part of the world, in Newfoundland, there's a project, a green hydrogen project, which received a sanction for its environmental and social impact assessment earlier this year. It's a 1 gigawatt onshore wind project with hydrogen and ammonia production. Just to give you again a sense of the scale, this is just showing you the areas where the phase 1 wind turbines will be located, about 164 turbines, rising to 4 gigawatts over time. The other areas highlighted in green show you the wider second phase areas that will be earmarked. This project is due to get sanctioned sometime in 2025. We'll have to see, listening to what Chris says, that we don't know if it will get sanctioned, but it is a project which has considerable support, but also there are concerns locally about ultimately local benefits, the balance between costs and benefits and impact management. It'll be an interesting project to watch. In other parts of the world, biodiversity concerns may be the predominant ones. In the case of the Hyphen project in Namibia, it overlaps with a national park, and there are significant concerns over biodiversity. Although the project has received the support from including the German government as a strategic foreign project, the ammonia would be transported to Germany predominantly. Environmentalists are somewhat alarmed about potential ecological impacts. It's a biodiversity hotspot. There are concerns of a potential cumulative impact from other renewable energy projects in the region, existing diamond mining and budding tourism in this area. In other areas, it may be the presence of vulnerable groups who may have different sensitivities to particular aspects of a renewable energy project. Could be greater sensitivity to noise or to shadow flicker, for example. In other areas, it's the question of waste management. Typically in these remote areas, there is no waste management infrastructure in place. So what happens with the solar panels? It's cheaper to send them to landfill, but there are toxic chemicals in them. So that is another important consideration, particularly when you're talking about multiple projects in the region, calls out for collaboration and coordination when you're dealing with these aspects. And wherever you are in the world, even in these remote areas, there are stakeholders. Sometimes they are nomadic or indigenous peoples who are present. It's an interesting overlap that for critical minerals around the world and areas that are suitable for renewable energy projects of this scale, there's a significant overlap with territories that are populated by indigenous peoples. So again, very important to carry out a thorough environmental and social baseline in data poor areas. Meaningful engagement is absolutely essential. So to conclude, impacts can be very location and context specific. It's not easy scaling up from the megawatt to the gigawatt stage, and social acceptance is something that has to be addressed from the earlier stage. Given the low awareness of what actually green hydrogen projects of this scale actually entail in terms of their spatial footprint, early consideration of the delivery of benefits, what is the value proposition, is very important, and managing those expectations from the earlier stages. And as Chris and Ariel have already pointed out, site selection, site optimization, and carrying out a constraints assessment is absolutely essential. There are concerns, there are pressures to fast-track permitting processes for renewable projects around the world, but it is risky, particularly with these series of projects, because that's what green hydrogen projects ultimately are. They are a series of infrastructure projects brought together. That is perhaps one of the aspects, along with the supply chain aspects, that distinguishes them somewhat from oil and gas and mining projects. So there are important considerations here. Again, land use and potential social conflicts have to be considered. There are studies which show that renewable energy projects are as conflictive as any fossil fuel project. In conclusion, green hydrogen certainly has a role to play, but not all projects will necessarily go ahead, be it for economic and commercial reasons, and in some cases there may be environmental and social issues that need to be carefully considered and that may add to the cost and tip the balance that a particular project will not go forward. But ultimately they are not a roadblock, but they are an important consideration. And with that, I will hand back to the organizer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jay, Ariel, and Chris, for sharing your experiences and for actually providing some really good case study examples. And I want to thank the audience as well for submitting questions through the question function in the GoToWebinar toggle bar there. So we appreciate that. We're going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to start with some of the ones that have already been submitted. And I invite the presenters to please engage their cameras, and recognizing that Jay is on audio only. But Ariel, if you would like to put your camera on as well. And I'm going to start with the first question going to Chris. Chris, we may have a developer in the audience right now, and they're seeking to get your input on for a potential green hydrogen project in West Africa, and what would be the best combination to bring in that green aspect of green hydrogen? Would it be hydropower or solar or wind? Recognizing this is off the top of your head answer.
No, it's an interesting question, and it can have multiple answers depending on what you're going to do with the hydrogen. I think if you have a customer which is happy with intermittent hydrogen supply, you could basically go for solar and provide hydrogen during daytime. If that would not be the case, and you would need to export it through liquid organic hydrogen carriers or ammonia, then it becomes basically a chemical plant. And there you need to take care of the flexibility or the limited flexibility of the ammonia synthesis loop. And there you need to have fairly baseload power, which could be delivered by hydropower with a number of caveats there, that you would need to make sure that you comply with the additionality requirements, where you don't use or compromise existing renewable energy supply to produce hydrogen, so that would need to be looked at. So in most of those projects, we see a combination of solar and wind. And there you would need to seek for the complementarity between wind and solar on a daily basis, but on a monthly and an annual basis as well. And so we see projects like I was involved in a project in the Middle East where on annual basis you would have fairly good wind capacity factors, but in reality you would have 7 months of very good wind and 5 months of hardly any wind, and for that matter the ammonia synthesis loop would fail for a big time of the year. Also the project where I was involved in together with Jay was having the same issues where we had a lot of wind, one of the most windiest, the windiest regions in the world. But even there, you would see that every week, every other week, you would have 2-3 days with hardly any wind. And for that, you would have to shut down the ammonia synthesis loop. It takes about 48 hours or even more to start up again. And so at the end of the day, the business case was not valid or not viable there. So it's really site specific. And it also is specific to what you do with the hydrogen, whether it's for local use or export. But complementarity and base load. So in generally speaking, the viability, the commercial viability of the project is of course driven by the full load hours on an annual basis that you have, or with the capacity factor, and of course that you would need to increase either through combination of solar and wind or battery storage.
Great, thank you for providing a little bit of insight into that question. I have another question that maybe Chris can start off with, and then Ariel and Jay can add in their views as well. The question is, are there any pilots in offshore floating platform hydrogen production as a maritime transport energy source? So are there any pilots in offshore floating platform hydrogen production as a maritime transport energy source?
Floating, I'm not quite sure. I know of a couple of projects where hydrogen or electrolyzers are being installed on existing or end-of-life oil and gas topsides, and to kind of blend the hydrogen into the existing gas infrastructure. I'm not really aware of floating systems, to be honest. And there again, it comes down to affordability. Whatever you do offshore is, of course, much more expensive than what you do onshore. And there, the main constraint, I think, is the affordability. The maritime sector is really promising as an enabler for green hydrogen and derivatives, whether it's ammonia or methanol.
Ariel and Jay, anything to add?
Not specific to the maritime aspect, but for floating offshore, I'm aware of at least 1 or 2 projects, one of them in the Caribbean region, where you have a scenario of an old refinery asset and pressures to restart it, but with a focus on decarbonization and production of green fuels, and with an floating offshore wind option considered. Actually, the only option for the start, because it's a small island, there's no space onshore. How feasible this particular project, which has received some serious investigation so far, as I'm aware, is beyond me to tell, given the challenges that Chris was setting out, commercial, political, and so on. But I know that there are a number of projects where that's being investigated. Remains to be seen whether they will see the light of day.
Yeah, and I agree with Chris's assessment. Cost will be a significant issue here in terms of any progress in that area.
Thank you. This next question is focusing in on life cycle assessment. So Ariel, I'll give the question and maybe you can start with Jay coming in as well. With your case study examples, was there a role for life cycle assessment in the field work? And could you speak to it in the context of a social life assessment approach? for the projects you were looking at?
Yeah, first of all, in our assessments, we did not apply life cycle assessments. There are methodologies that you can use them. You can use life cycle assessment as a way to preliminary assess the sensitivity of reseller site selection. No, wasn't that in our case. We focus primarily on biodiversity and social issues associated with the sources of labor, impacts to local communities, impacts to, like Jay mentioned earlier, potential indigenous communities that own the land, but not in terms of a life cycle assessment.
Yeah, in our project, likewise, that wasn't a consideration at that stage. And remember, it was an early stage integrated assessment, but I would say that any project of that scale, with that many, in this case, wind turbines, you're going to have to look at those types of issues down the line. And as I hinted at the beginning, that is perhaps an area where, particularly for wind turbines, where you're sourcing the materials from, the human rights aspect will become or could become more of an issue, but it wasn't something that featured at that stage of the assessment. I'm sure it would have had the project gone to the next stage.
Thank you. And then, Chris, there's a question in regards to the small modular nuclear reactors and if they're being considered as a complementary source of energy for green hydrogen.
I know that France in particular is going the nuclear way. Of course, they're having a huge asset base on nuclear. Again, it comes down to the cost. I'm not quite sure. I don't know of any projects that would solely run on SMRs to produce hydrogen. I'm not even quite clear on what the cost of electricity would be. But if you want to produce hydrogen at an affordable cost, I think your power supply would need to come at maximum, let's say $20 per megawatt hour. I'm not quite clear on whether SMR can deliver at that cost. So again, sorry to say, it comes back to affordability. Remember, you need about 50 to 60 kilowatt hours to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. So if your cost of electricity is, let's say, 50, you are at 2.5 euros per kilogram for the hydrogen itself without having a facility to produce hydrogen. So it's just the electricity component. So you quickly are out of scope. And that's one of the main reasons to go and find locations where you can produce really cheap renewable hydrogen, even though, as per the European regulations, nuclear is considered renewable as well. So, but I don't know of any specific projects that would rely on SMRs. Sorry for that.
Thank you. For Jay and for Ariel, and starting with Jay, could you talk about any challenges that you faced in trying to assess or model potential impacts in the context of any potential confidentiality clauses with the technology being used, or maybe it's new technology coming out and they don't yet know, their noise emissions or their air emissions or waste emissions and things like that?
Well, the project that we looked at, that was not a consideration at that stage. It was the easy answer. I think sort of depending again on location and context, I don't know, use of drones to acquire data in data poor regions, that certainly raises, I guess, data protection issues, I can imagine. But for that specific application, for that specific green hydrogen project, that was not a consideration. I don't know if Ariel has any more experience on that from the wind projects in Patagonia.
In terms of noise technologies, technologies to measure noise, is that what the question was about?
No, the question was related to maybe using the new technologies. The developers might not yet know what noise their technologies may be producing and how that kind of information, the gap of information, might factor into determining what the potential environmental and social impacts are.
Yeah, well, it's true. Certain technologies are incipient yet, still in terms of what will be used in the field once the project is developed. But as in regular traditional wind farms, the difference is between the noise at the source and the noise at the receptors. And consequently, in the case of Patagonia, where we have vast areas of unpopulated regions, the potential noise impact on social receptors will have to be measured later on in the process. What we all can do at this stage is provide background for a sensitivity analysis to estimate current knowledge of noise impacts on social receptors, and based on that, help the developer in terms of siting of these projects. But in terms of the new technologies that might come out, it's not only on noise. I mean, as Chris and Jay can testify, hydrogen technologies, hydrogen production technologies are evolving constantly. And what the developer might have today in terms of site selection might not be the same in terms of technologies, in 3, 4, or 5 years from now.
Yeah. Perhaps just add, I mean, this is not a question of new technology, but there's one case involving onshore wind farm in Norway, which ended up in the High Court of Norway in 2021, where Sami Reindeer herd, as the Fossen case it's called, launched an appeal objecting to the what was at the time the largest onshore wind project in Europe. Successfully in the end, the licenses were basically declared invalid by the government because of lack of consultation. But one of the impacts that were alleging was the impact on the reindeer, the noise and visual impact that was impeding their feeding and migratory routes. And so that's not a question of new technology, but it is certainly showing how noise impacts and renewable energy can play out depending on the context. And here it certainly did.
Thank you for providing those examples and insight into that. And I know Jay's audio was a little bit muffled, but he was speaking about a court case in Norway. Moving a little bit to the technical side, could the speakers talk a bit about the safety risks of green hydrogen or ammonia production and how setback areas are determined? And this might be a question starting with Ariel to answer, Jay, and then Chris. And then Ariel, you had the slide on costs of increase in costs when you factor in environmental protection or environmental management in on it. And there's a similar question if you've done any research or have the information available to relate that to a solid health and safety management system in place and not just an environmental and social management system.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, a proper environmental and social management system, particularly for mega projects like hydrogen production, I would consider a mega project, require significant budget of the project dedicated to the life of the project in terms of management of environmental and social aspects. In the old days, when I was involved in the Panama Canal expansion program, the estimates were between 1 and 2.7% of the budget in order to properly manage the environmental and social activities throughout the life of the project. That has changed throughout the years. There's more efficiency in the way we manage and also better methodology than 10, 15 years ago. But the impact of proper ESMS at the project level is crucial in terms of cost reductions. I don't know if that answered the question that you posed, Deborah.
It gave a bit of insight into it, but you know, it's just hard to provide fixed percentages or of cost related to these things, but you've given some good guidelines for that. We've got a question about with the Morocco case study, there was about 10,000 hectares set aside for agricultural development. And the question is related to the case study or the project in Mauritania, and if there's any biodiversity conservation areas being set aside for that.
Those are two different questions, or?
Well, one was a comment that the Mauritania project set aside 10,000 hectares for agriculture. And the question is there anything similar being done for the project in Mauritania in regards to biodiversity conservation?
Yeah, that's being studied. So the thing in Morocco is basically a result from interactions we had with the local communities on what their needs were and the potential that they saw. And so then during those discussions, which were quite informal in the early stage of the project, agriculture came up as one of us on top of their wish list. So, and for that, into the overall mapping and zoning of the project, 10,000 hectares has been made available, which is basically comes at a cost to the project, and irrigation water would be supplied. But of course, the project is not into agriculture; it's into producing green hydrogen and derivatives. And that's one of the challenges or the opportunities, is that how do you then engage with the local community to actually also properly make use of that water and that opportunity which is created to them. And we are now going through similar discussions in Mauritania to see how we can actually create tangible benefits to the local communities and stakeholders, knowing that we have to kind of please local governments. We have to create a win-win between the project developer, the hosting country, and of course, more important, even local communities, and that's not always easy. There's a lot of wishes, there's a lot of ideas, but it's not easy to put it in practice. So that's work which is still going on.
Thank you. I'm scrolling through the questions, and we have many more questions that we won't be able to get to, unfortunately, in this one, but we may organize a part 2 to try and bring in some of those additional questions. You know, this webinar really focused in on the green hydrogen production side of it, with touching on the use of the green hydrogen. I know there's some questions coming in on what is the EU using for green hydrogen, what is the EU using for green hydrogen, so we can maybe tackle some of those types of questions in a part 2. I guess on one of the latter questions is related to social impacts, and I know Ariel and Jay and Chris, you've mentioned social impacts related to making sure that there's a local workforce that has the right technical skills to come in on this, that there's some social issues related to the conversion of large areas of land to an industrial use. There's also some community health and safety concerns that all the speakers spoke about. Could you give examples of some other potential social impacts related to green hydrogen, starting with Ariel and going to Jay and then Chris?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, in the case of Patagonia in Argentina, there is an existing skilled labor force that could be easily adapted for the project needs. There will be a need for transport and housing of these workers, this personnel, wherever the project is sited. Transport of new personnel from dormitories or from communities where they will live to the project site increases health and safety issues on the roads. Import of working force into communities also addresses issues of requires addressing issues such as diseases or other social interactions with local communities between the workers and the communities nearby. There are multiple social aspects that need to be addressed where these workers will be spending their free time, how they spend their free time in interacting with the communities. There are multiple social issues that need to be addressed, and particularly when we're talking about different skills that are required. In the past, in traditional wind farm projects, we were talking about a set of labor skills that were different during construction and during operation, but also in terms of the specialties needed. In the case of green energy, green hydrogen, we have the components that require multiple other labor skills, and that also has influence on the social interaction with the local communities. Where are these workers coming from? What are their actual skills and how they interact with the community? So yes, the situation is much more complex. It's nothing that cannot be, I mean, everything can be resolved, but they have to be addressed early in the process and in agreement with the local stakeholders.
Yeah, I quite agree with that. I say the labor influx issue is an important one, but how it plays out depends again on the scale, the number of workers that are coming in, the existing infrastructure. There are some areas where you just have to go for a closed camp option. There are too many sensitivities, but even I would say you can have relatively smaller projects, but if they're in a particularly either environmentally, socially sensitive area, this was actually a road project we were involved with years back. It's going through an indigenous community, relatively small numbers of workers who were not abiding by, or there was no code of conduct, could have a disproportionate impact. But looking at the sort of the benefit side, as both my colleagues have said, attracting skilled workers to remote locations is not easy. But in some cases, it really is also sort of small islands. You have a diaspora of people who've moved away who might come back if there is sufficient, a prospect of longer term employment. So it depends on the scale of the project and what is put in place, the collaboration with government and perhaps other players, so that there's a longer term perspective. Yes, it's worth my while studying engineering or going and getting a qualification that would qualify me to get into that sector. So how that plays out really depends on local circumstances, on different players, government, industry, and so on. So it's a very good question.
Yeah, and this when we talk about green hydrogen projects meant for export, like those in Morocco and Mauritania, I mean, it needs to be big right from the start. If not, it will not be economically feasible. But the fact that it's big also requires a lot of people at the same time. And it's not, I mean, at the end of the day, you're building a chemical plant, a huge chemical plant. If you look at 1 million ton ammonia plant, that's a proper chemical plant, which basically sits or would be sitting in the middle of the desert. And so the complexity and also the risks associated with hydrogen and ammonia still being toxic and explosive, etc., is of totally different nature than a renewable energy project, where you would typically start with, well, smaller solar projects, and then you scale up and you have time. I mean, the country has time to adapt to that and to put up universities to start training people, where you start with 5 megawatt and then 10 and then maybe 50 and then 200. So over years, those people would be trained, which is different. We don't have that opportunity where we could start with a very small project, because it's just simply not feasible. It's not economically feasible. So, and that really brings, quite a bit of headaches. Where, I mean, the project in Saudi, NEOM, That's one of the main issues now, to get the workforce, but also the white collars, because they need to have a lot of chemical engineers, and in that project does not sit in the most lucrative place on earth where you would be, or you would want to be sent to as a chemical engineer graduated from some prestigious university. So that's really an issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think part of the concluding remarks here before turning it back to IAIA HQ is just that the just transition really needs to take into account some of the larger issues that we're facing both upstream and downstream with potential human rights impacts, the sources of critical minerals, supply chain, labor, and biodiversity potential issues. And as Chris and Ariel and Jay have mentioned as well, these projects are not cheap. Green hydrogen is not cheap to produce, and to factor in some of the location factors into the decision making so that there is a final investment decision that goes forward really does take time and thought. And although the focus may be at the beginning to make sure it's financially viable, both Jay and Ariel have given some really good examples of some environmental and social impacts and challenges that really need to be considered in as part of the early design stage and planning of that. We're coming to an end now, and I'm going to turn it back to IAIA HQ. Just a big thank you to Chris, Ariel, and Jay for sharing their experiences. And if there's interest, we can organize a part 2 and delve into some of the other questions we haven't had a chance to discuss here. Thank you very much. Keisha, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We know your schedules are busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time and spending some time here with us. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if there was anything you heard that you'd like to share on socials, you can see our handle there as well as a hashtag you can use. And finally, the last thing I want to mention is that as you leave here today, you'll be prompted to fill out an evaluation survey. And we ask that you do please take the time to fill that out because it really helps us make sure that we're giving you the best experience possible on these webinars. And as Deborah mentioned, one of the possibilities that you can put down on that evaluation survey, it asks you to give us any suggestions for topics of future webinars. So if you are interested in getting a part 2, or if you have a specific suggestion for kind of a part 2 that they might branch off on and give, please let us know and I will do my best to coordinate speakers for that webinar and get that for you. So again, thank you all for joining. Just a reminder that the recording will be available within about 2 days of this live broadcast. And if you have any questions, please reach out. So until next time, thank you for joining.